A balding man sits with his legs crossed, one bare foot thrust forward into the viewer's own space, dirt visible in the creases of his toes, while a winged figure leans in close behind him, small fingers wrapped around the old man's knuckles as though correcting a child's grip on a pen. This is Matthew, apostle and evangelist, author of the first gospel, and Caravaggio painted him this way in 1602 for the high altar of the Contarelli Chapel in Rome, not seated on a throne, not robed in the flowing scarlet that usually announces sainthood on sight. A working man, weathered and unlettered, caught mid-lesson, his brow furrowed in the particular confusion of someone asked to do something his hands were never trained for. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Behind him and above, the angel's wing cuts a sharp diagonal against a background so dark it barely registers as a room at all, the two figures pulled forward out of the shadow by a single unexplained source of light, the same theatrical illumination Caravaggio had already used to make a tax collector's table feel like the most important surface in Rome. The painting hung above that altar for a matter of weeks before the clergy of San Luigi dei Francesi had it taken down and told Caravaggio to paint another one. What exactly did they see in that face and those feet that made an evangelist unfit for their altar? And why, more than 4 centuries later, can historians still describe exactly what the priests refused to look at when the object itself no longer physically exists anywhere on earth? The chapel that produced this painting had been waiting for its centerpiece for nearly 2 decades. Cardinal Matteo Contarelli, a Frenchman who had risen through the papal bureaucracy under the birth name Mathieu Cointrel, purchased the rights to a chapel inside San Luigi dei Francesi, the French national church, a few streets from the Pantheon, and left extraordinarily detailed instructions in his will for how the space should honor his named saint. He specified 3 scenes from the life of Matthew: the calling from the tax collector's table, the martyrdom at the altar where the apostle would eventually be killed, and a central image of the saint receiving divine assistance in writing his gospel. And he described in his will roughly how each composition ought to be arranged. Contarelli died in 1585 without seeing a single brushstroke applied. For more than a decade afterward, the commission simply drifted. The executors first hired a sculptor named Jacob Cobert to carve a marble Matthew for the central niche, and Cobert spent years on it, producing a figure the executors judged too weak and too static to anchor the chapel, a stiff, conventional Matthew that satisfied every rule of decorum and inspired almost nobody who saw it, a fact worth holding on to given what would eventually happen to the painting that replaced it. Only after the sculptural plan collapsed did the young and unusually influential Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, who had taken the still largely unproven Caravaggio into his own household as a kind of resident painter some years earlier, put the artist's name forward for the 2 side canvases. At that point, Caravaggio had built a reputation almost entirely on smaller-scale paintings made for private patrons: boys with fruit, a lute player, a young Bacchus, works admired for their startling physical presence, but nothing like the scale or public visibility of a chapel altarpiece in one of Rome's most frequented churches. The Contarelli commission was, for an artist still in his 20s, an enormous leap in both size and consequence, the first time his particular way of seeing would be tested in front of a congregation rather than a private collector who had already chosen to like his work. Caravaggio delivered the calling of St. Matthew and the martyrdom of St. Matthew around 1600, and both landed on the Roman art world like a provocation. He painted the calling not as a solemn historical tableau in the Mannerist style, still dominant in Rome, but as a scene lit like a tavern at dusk. Ordinary men in contemporary dress gathered around a table counting coins, a single shaft of light cutting through the gloom to find the tax collector at the exact instant his life changed. Nothing in Roman religious painting had prepared audiences for lighting handled this way. Figures modeled from the same tenebrism a theater might use to isolate a single actor on an otherwise dark stage. Caravaggio worked without the preparatory drawings that every other major workshop in Rome relied on, painting directly onto a primed canvas and scoring faint guidelines into the wet ground with the pointed end of a brush handle, a method later technical analysis of his surviving canvases has confirmed again and again. To artists trained in the disegno tradition, the practice of careful preliminary drawing that Florentine and Roman workshops had elevated into something close to doctrine, painting this way looked less like confidence and more like recklessness. an artist working out his composition directly on the surface meant for public devotion. The two finished canvases made Caravaggio's reputation almost overnight regardless. But the central altarpiece, the image that would sit directly above the altar where the sacrament itself was consecrated during Mass, remained unfinished, and this was not a minor gap. San Luigi dei Francesi served Rome's French community, a congregation that regularly included cardinals, ambassadors, and visiting nobility who would look directly at that altarpiece during every service. Whatever hung there needed to satisfy expectations that had hardened considerably in the decades since the Council of Trent concluded its 25th session on sacred art in 1563, decrees instructing bishops to ensure that images placed in churches avoided anything false, anything disorderly, or anything that might become, in the Council's own phrase, an occasion of error for the unlearned. That same session warned against images painted with undue beauty exciting to lust, language aimed originally at nude figures, but interpreted over the following decades to cover a much wider range of perceived impropriety, including, local church authorities increasingly argued, figures whose social bearing read as too low for the sacred role they occupied. Enforcement of these standards fell to individual bishops and, in practice, to the parish clergy and executors who actually commissioned and accepted finished work, which meant a painting's fate could hinge on the taste and anxiety of a small handful of men rather than on any single fixed rule written into Trent's own text. The Contarelli Chapel itself sat in relative dimness, lit mainly by a narrow window and whatever candlelight accompanied the Mass, conditions that suited Caravaggio's tenebrism for the two side canvases and made the central altarpiece, hung closest to worshippers' own eye level, the one image in the chapel that congregants would study most directly and for the longest stretches of time. An evangelist, above every other kind of religious figure, needed to project the settled authority of Scripture itself. Caravaggio, whose entire working method depended on painting directly from live models recruited from the streets, markets, and taverns of Rome, rather than from any idealized studio type passed down through generations of workshop practice, was about to test precisely how far that authority could bend before an entire congregation decided it had broken. What Caravaggio delivered for the altar was not a philosopher receiving revelation in some marble study. It was a laborer being taught, in real time and at close physical range, how to write. The composition placed Matthew on a plain wooden bench, his body twisted awkwardly to accommodate the angel pressed in directly behind him, the two figures locked in a proximity that had no real precedent in the iconography built up around the four evangelists over more than 1,000 years of Christian art. Crossed legs themselves carried meaning in the visual language of the period. Painters reserved that pose almost exclusively for peasants, tavern keepers, and other figures of low or informal social standing, never for apostles, and certainly never for the author of Scripture seated at the moment of its composition. Matthew's knee juts forward, his bare foot practically crossing the picture plane into the viewer's own space, the toes and heel rendered with the same unflinching naturalism Caravaggio gave to bruised fruit or a soldier's dented breastplate elsewhere in his work. His face carries none of the serene, far-away concentration painters conventionally gave to men receiving divine wisdom. It carries visible strain, the specific effort of someone whose hand is being physically guided across a page, because, the composition implies without ever stating it outright, he does not know how to write on his own. The angel is not hovering at a respectful distance overhead, dictating the way angels typically appear in scenes of scriptural inspiration across the period. Its small fingers are wrapped directly around Matthew's own, guiding the pen stroke by stroke, in a gesture of instruction so physically intimate, it reads less like inspiration than like a parent steadying a child's first attempt at handwriting. Some scholars studying the surviving photographs have noted a resemblance between this Matthew and the aged, deeply lined male model who appears to recur across several of Caravaggio's other religious works from the same years, a figure whose identity has never been documented in any surviving record and remains, at best, an informed guess rather than a settled attribution. Contemporary written accounts confirm that the reading of the finished altarpiece as scandalous was not invented later by scholars hunting for controversy. It was the immediate and specific objection raised by the clergy themselves. The biographer Giovanni Pietro Bellori, writing decades afterward, but drawing on testimony close to the original controversy, recorded that the priests rejected the painting because St. Matthew appeared seated with his legs crossed and his bare feet crudely exposed to public view, a figure the executors judged to lack the decorum the subject demanded. Decorum was not a vague aesthetic preference in this period. It carried real theological weight in the Post-Tridentine Church, describing the fitness of an image for sacred use, rather than simple good manners. An altarpiece judged to lack decorum was not merely unrefined. It risked functioning, in the language churchmen of the period actually used, as an obstacle to devotion rather than an aid to it, the wrong kind of image standing between the faithful and the mystery it was meant to make plain. Giovanni Baglione, a rival painter whose early biography of Caravaggio was frequently hostile and unreliable on points of chronology, nonetheless corroborated the basic outline of the story, even through his evident dislike of the man, describing a painting so lacking in the dignity expected of an evangelist that the priests would not accept it for their altar. Some modern scholars have debated exactly how long the painting hung in place before it came down, whether it was formally installed at all or pulled before the dedication, a gap in the surviving record that later accounts do not fully resolve, and later biographers writing at different distances from the actual event did not always agree on precisely which objection came first: the crossed legs, the exposed feet, or the overall absence of what Bellori called decorum, though every version of the story keeps landing on the same underlying complaint about a saint who did not look sufficiently unlike the men who might have been sitting in the pews. What is not disputed is the outcome. Within a very short window, the canvas was removed. Modern conservators studying Caravaggio's surviving canvases, including the second Contarelli Altarpiece still in the chapel, routinely use infrared reflectography and X-ray imaging to find the pentimenti buried under the finished paint layer, the shifted arm, the repositioned hand, the compositional second thought Caravaggio made directly on the canvas rather than on a preparatory sheet, because he rarely used one. That kind of technical examination has told art historians a great deal about how Caravaggio actually worked, session by session, correction by correction. None of it is possible for the first Matthew. There is no canvas left to scan, no paint layer left to X-ray, no pigment left to sample for a laboratory to analyze. Whatever second thoughts Caravaggio made while painting the rejected altarpiece, whatever changes of mind lie buried under its final surface, are questions that photography alone can never fully answer, since a photograph only records what a finished picture looks like on top, not what a painter changed his mind about underneath it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Removing an altarpiece the church had already commissioned and, in all likelihood, already paid for, created an immediate problem, and Caravaggio did not have to look far to solve it. Vincenzo Giustiniani, a Genoese-born banker and marquis who had been collecting Caravaggio's work for several years, and had in fact been serving as one of the executors overseeing the broader Contarelli commission, purchased the rejected canvas privately for his own gallery at the Palazzo Giustiniani. This was not an act of charity toward a painter in professional trouble. Giustiniani was assembling one of the most theoretically ambitious private picture collections in Rome, later setting down his own ideas about painting in a short treatise that ranked artistic merit across a graduated scale from simple copying to fully independent invention, and a canvas the church itself had found too radical for public devotion was, inside a banker's private residence, simply further evidence of the artist's ambition and technical daring. The painting hung there among the other works by Caravaggio that Giustiniani had assembled, seen not by ordinary parishioners but by the connoisseurs, diplomats, and visiting collectors who toured the palazzo as a matter of cultural business in Rome. Giustiniani's relationship with Caravaggio did not end with this purchase. He went on to commission new work directly from the artist in the years that followed, including The Incredulity of St. Thomas, a canvas showing the Apostle Thomas pressing his finger directly into the wound in Christ's side, a subject that pushed the same kind of unflinching physical literalness the church had just rejected in Matthew, and this time there was no clergy to object, because the painting was made for a private gallery from the start, rather than for a public altar. Giustiniani, in other words, had effectively become the market that absorbed exactly the kind of religious realism institutional Rome kept refusing to hang above its altars, a private gallery that had effectively become the overflow space for a version of sacred art the churches themselves were not yet ready to display in public. Caravaggio, for his part, returned to the Contarelli Chapel with a second attempt, and this time he produced something considerably closer to what the clergy had expected from the start. In the replacement, known today as the inspiration of St. Matthew. Every point of physical contact between saint and angel disappears. The angel now floats above Matthew on a bank of cloud, gesturing with one raised hand and counting points off on its fingers as though dictating from a comfortable, respectful distance, rather than guiding a pen by direct physical force. Matthew himself has changed almost completely. He kneels at a proper writing desk wrapped in flowing robes, his bare feet no longer thrust toward the viewer, but tucked discreetly beneath the bench, his face turned upward in an expression of receptive wonder rather than furrowed strain. He looks, in every particular the first version withheld, like a saint is conventionally supposed to look. This second version is the one that still hangs above the altar in the Contarelli Chapel today, the image tourists and worshippers see when they feed a coin into the light box that briefly illuminates the chapel between long stretches of darkness. It is the version that survived to be seen at all. The Giustiniani collection remained substantially intact in Rome for roughly 2 centuries, passed down through successive generations of the family, until the disruptions of the Napoleonic period pushed a wave of aristocratic Italian collections onto the international art market, as noble households across the peninsula came under serious financial strain. In 1815, King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, acting on the advice of court advisors eager to build Berlin into a museum capital that could stand alongside Paris and London, purchased a substantial portion of the Giustiniani paintings for the Prussian royal collections. Caravaggio's Rejected Matthew crossed the Alps as part of that purchase, and eventually entered what would become the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, an institution built specifically to house precisely the kind of old master painting that Berlin's rapidly expanding museum culture wanted on permanent display. For well over a century, the painting remained in Berlin, studied by generations of art historians, reproduced in the black and white photographic plates that scholarly catalogues of the period relied on, a well-documented and internationally recognized work of Caravaggio's early maturity, even though it had begun its existence as something a Roman congregation had found too coarse to keep above its own altar. German scholars writing in the early 20th century treated the Berlin canvas as an essential document for understanding how Caravaggio's altarpiece style had developed between his first Roman commissions and his more settled later work, comparing it directly against the surviving second version still hanging in the Contarelli Chapel, and using the two paintings together to trace exactly how far the artist had been pushed to compromise between one attempt and the next. There is a particular irony sitting inside this stretch of the painting's history. Caravaggio's broader reputation spent much of the 18th and 19th centuries in relative eclipse, his naturalism, treated by later academic taste as a talented but unrefined starting point that classicizing painters had improved upon, and it took the Italian scholar Roberto Longhi's sustained 20th century research, culminating in a landmark exhibition mounted in Milan in 1951, to fully restore Caravaggio's standing as one of the defining figures in the entire history of European painting. That exhibition arrived only 6 years after the fire in Berlin. The rediscovery that finally convinced the art world to take Caravaggio's radical naturalism seriously, the exact quality visible in the crossed legs and dirty feet of the first Matthew, happened just after the single painting that displayed those qualities most directly had already been reduced to ash. Then came the final weeks of the Second World War. As Allied bombing intensified over Berlin through the winter and spring of 1945, and the Red Army closed in on the city from the east, museum officials scrambled to move the most valuable holdings under their care into what seemed, on paper, one of the safest structures available to them, a purpose-built anti-aircraft tower known as the Flakturm Friedrichshain, one of several massive above-ground concrete fortresses the German state had built in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna earlier in the war to mount anti-aircraft guns and shelter civilians during air raids, structures with walls thick enough that officials came to regard their lower chambers as some of the safest storage space left in the capital. Hundreds of paintings drawn from the Kaiser Friedrich Museum and the wider Berlin state collections were carried into the tower's lower storage chambers, alongside sculpture and other holdings evacuated as the war reached its collapse. In May of 1945, in the chaotic days immediately following the fall of Berlin to Soviet forces, fire broke out inside the tower's storage rooms, not once but in 2 separate incidents, spaced weeks apart. The precise cause has never been established with certainty. Looting, arson, and accidental ignition amid the general disorder of a defeated and occupied city have all been proposed by historians who have tried to reconstruct exactly what happened inside a building that, by its very design, was meant to be nearly impossible to breach. The result, whatever combination of causes produced it, is not in dispute. The fires consumed a substantial portion of everything that had been moved into the tower for safekeeping, and Caravaggio's St. Matthew and the Angel, the painting a Roman congregation had once judged too undignified for its altar, was among the works destroyed. The physical canvas that had scandalized a chapel in 1602, that had hung for 2 centuries in a private banker's palazzo, that had crossed Europe to enter a national museum collection, ceased to exist inside a single fire more than 300 years after it was painted. What survives now is not paint on canvas, but photographic record, chiefly a set of black and white plates produced before the war by German art historical archives that had documented the Kaiser Friedrich Museum's holdings in careful institutional detail, the kind of routine cataloging photography that seemed at the time like bureaucratic housekeeping and turned out, decades later, to be the only thing standing between the painting and total disappearance. Scholars today reconstruct the composition, the exact fall of light across Matthew's furrowed forehead, the precise angle of the crossed leg, and the exposed heel, entirely from these surviving images, and from a small number of period copies made by other hands, while the original still hung somewhere for a copyist to study. Every modern description of what the rejected Matthew actually looked like, including the description that opened this account, depends on photographs taken by archivists who almost certainly had no idea they were preserving the last physical evidence of a painting that would not survive its own century. Routine documentation that turned out, by the ordinary accident of not being stored in the same room as the paintings it recorded, to be the one copy of the image that outlasted the war. Set the 2 versions of Matthew beside each other, the destroyed original known only through photographs and the surviving replacement still hanging in its chapel, and the nature of the original objection becomes considerably clearer than any single contemporary account states outright on its own. The theological content of the 2 paintings is nearly identical. Both show Matthew receiving angelic assistance in composing his gospel. Neither version contradicts scripture or introduces any doctrinally suspect content of the kind that actually triggered formal censorship elsewhere during this period of heightened vigilance over sacred imagery. What changed between the 2 versions was almost entirely a matter of physical bearing and social class rendered in paint. The first Matthew looked like exactly what Caravaggio's models usually were. Laborers and street people paid a modest sum to sit for a few hours, rendered with the same unsentimental accuracy the painter brought to a basket of overripe fruit or the dented armor of an ordinary soldier. His feet were dirty because Caravaggio painted the feet of a man who actually walked through Roman streets, rather than the idealized, unmarked feet of pious convention. His visible confusion at the pen was legible because Caravaggio painted the specific physical difficulty an illiterate adult experiences when asked to write, a difficulty the artist evidently observed somewhere in the city and transferred with startling directness onto consecrated canvas. The second Matthew erased nearly every one of these specifics in favor of generalized nobility, flowing robes in place of a laborer's tunic, an upturned face of receptive grace in place of visible strain, feet withdrawn from the viewer's space in place of feet thrust into it. Even the physical distance between the 2 figures changed to make the point. In the first version, the angel's body presses in against Matthew's shoulder, close enough that the folds of drapery from one figure overlap the other, a closeness that read to 17th century eyes as something closer to an embrace than an act of instruction. In the second version, several feet of open air separate the 2 figures entirely, the angel suspended on its own cloud above and to the side, a compositional decision that solved the decorum problem by the simplest available means, distance. The rejection, read this way, was never really about theology at all. It was about whether a chapel serving French cardinals and visiting ambassadors could tolerate an evangelist who looked as though he had been recruited off the street that same morning, however precisely observed and however technically extraordinary that evangelist might be. This was not an isolated incident in Caravaggio's career, and later controversies followed a nearly identical pattern. He had already unsettled earlier patrons by giving pilgrims dirty, travel-worn feet in the Madonna di Loreto, and he would go on to scandalize a different set of patrons a few years afterward with the Death of the Virgin, a painting reportedly modeled in part on the body of a drowned woman recovered from the Tiber, a canvas that was likewise removed from its intended church for lacking the dignity the subject was believed to require. Across each of these episodes runs the same underlying pattern. Caravaggio kept insisting that holiness could inhabit ordinary, weathered, physically specific bodies drawn straight from the city around him, and the institutions paying for these images kept insisting otherwise, preferring sanctity delivered in the safer visual vocabulary of idealized nobility that left no ambiguity whatsoever about a figure's spiritual rank. Rival painters working in Rome at the same moment, particularly Annibale Carracci and the circle of artists trained in his more classicizing Bolognese manner, offered patrons an alternative that conservative clergy increasingly preferred, figures still grounded in observed anatomy, but smoothed toward an ideal, rather than left in the raw, particular state Caravaggio insisted on. Carracci himself was at work on his own major Roman commission, the ceiling of the Palazzo Farnese, during these same years, and the two approaches, his idealizing classicism and Caravaggio's unsparing naturalism, would go on to define the two poles between which nearly every ambitious painter working in Rome over the following decades felt compelled to position himself. The Contarelli rejection was, in miniature, an early skirmish in a much larger argument about what naturalism owed to dignity, an argument Roman religious painting would keep having in various forms for the rest of the century. The inspiration of St. Matthew still hangs today exactly where the second attempt was installed, above the altar of the Contarelli Chapel inside San Luigi dei Francesi, a short walk from the Pantheon, visible for a few coin-operated minutes of light, alongside the calling and the martyrdom that flank it on either wall. Visitors who stand in that chapel are looking at the version the clergy went on to accept, the compromise Caravaggio reached after his first attempt was pulled down within weeks of going up, and almost none of them realize that an entirely different painting once occupied that exact same space, a work more physically daring and more psychologically strange than the one now hanging there, a work that no longer exists in any physical form except a handful of grainy photographic plates and the written testimony of men who judged it unfit for public devotion. What the church rejected as lacking decorum turned out, through the accident of a museum fire nearly 3.5 centuries later, to be the version that vanished entirely, while the safer, corrected painting is the one that survived to be seen by anyone who books a flight to Rome. The evangelist available to us today is not the evangelist Caravaggio first imagined for that altar. The one he first imagined, dirty feet, furrowed brow, a child's grip guided across the page, exists now only as a photograph of something that used to be paint, held in an archive on the far side of a fire nobody planned, and nobody, in the end, could fully explain. What reads to a modern audience as the stronger of the two paintings is very often the one the priests refused. Contemporary viewers, trained by a century of scholarship that prizes exactly the unsentimental, working-class naturalism Trent-era clergy found indecorous, tend to respond to the crossed leg and the exposed heel as evidence of Caravaggio's daring, rather than as a lapse in judgment, an inversion of taste that the church executors of 1602 could not have anticipated and would very likely not have understood, even if it had been explained to them. They were protecting an altar. They had no way of knowing they were also, without meaning to, consigning the more radical painting to a private collection that history would eventually carry into the path of a fire. Every account of the Contarelli Chapel written today has to hold two facts side by side that do not sit comfortably together: that the painting Rome judged unworthy of its altar was, on the evidence of the photographs alone, the more searching and more technically confident of the two attempts, and that the painting judged worthy is the only one anyone can still stand in front of. Decorum won the argument in 1602. It did not win the argument that art history has been having about the two paintings ever since, an argument that can now only be conducted with one side of the comparison present in the room and the other side present only in reproduction. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.